Hello and welcome to The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
All right, Jeremy. Well, first of all, must say that it is very, I don't know if interesting, I don't know if surreal, I don't think it's necessarily a shocker, but just the overnight, absolute, complete mainstreaming of this Q Anon, which we've talked about extensively on this program. We've shared our views on that ad nauseum. I don't think we need to get back into talking about where we stand or what it may or may not be, but the mainstreaming of it literally overnight at a Trump Florida rally, a few people showed up holding signs alluding to Q and created an absolute media firestorm. And so now, just in the span of a week, since I think Wednesday, literally, we've had the Q Anon has become addressed within pretty much every mainstream outlet that you can think of. It's been quite interesting to see this play out, although I wouldn't call it shocking.
No, but it does seem scripted in a certain way, and it's hard to tell whether it's just a response to the phenomenon of Q at that specific rally, or whether there's deeper temporal scripting going on here. But either way, it exposes a lot around the sort of falsely constructed attacker and attacked of this whole Trump era, I would say.
Well, we're going to get into this here, and it's going to be much more deeper analysis than whether or not Trump is secretly signaling QAnon or not. But there's been a number of obviously, I think pretty much everybody in the media has probably had their say on Q, and it's mostly been the typical derisive kind of mocking tone from your liberal, quote unquote, court jesters such as Bill Maher. I watched his spiel on Q, but we have a clip ready to go of Chris Hayes on MSNBC with Sam Cedar, where they're discussing Q that I think gives a pretty good insight into the direction where we're going to go with what we're thinking with regards to possibly a bigger picture analysis of Q at this moment, coinciding with this mainstream overnight just complete major media campaign to actually cover Q. So if you want to start out this clip, and we'll comment on it as it goes along.
If you tuned into Donald Trump's rally in Tampa, Florida last night, you might have noticed a somewhat ubiquitous Q symbol on signs in the crowd. And if you are lucky enough not to have had to interact with this idea, let me take a moment to explain. Those Trump supporters you see waving around the letter Q printed on signs and on their T-shirts are followers of Q, a anonymous poster on the message boards 4chan and 8chan. Q claims to be sharing insider government secrets of the masses and has spawned an entire movement, QAnon, which essentially believes the entirety of the Democratic Party and much of Hollywood are conspiring and running an underground pedophile sex trafficking ring. Even Tom Hanks. And the followers of Q also believe that President Donald Trump is working secretly with the generals to expose this entire sick thing, and that the Mueller probe isn't actually investigating Donald Trump, but Robert Mueller and Donald Trump are actually investigating the Obamas and the Clintons, all of whom are wearing ankle bracelets because they've already been secretly indicted. Now, if you're hearing this for the first time, your reaction is correct. This is all insane and incoherent. It is also shockingly widespread, as evidenced by last night. And remember when Roseanne Barr tweeted about how President Trump has freed so many children held in bondage to pimps all over this world? That was a QAnon reference. Kurt Schilling has linked to a pro-QAnon video on his Facebook account. And Sean Hannity retweeted a hashtag QAnon tweet this past January. The QAnon Reddit board, Great Awakening, has almost 50,000 subscribers. Its YouTube videos regularly get hundreds of thousands of views. It's a conspiracy theory that appears to be growing in strength, and it had its coming out party at the president's rally in Tampa last night. I want to bring in two people who have been tracking the growth of this conspiracy theory. MSNBC contributor Sam Cedar, hosts the Majority Report, and Will Sommer, tech and internet reporter for the Daily Beast, who has been on this. Will, I want to start with...
By the way, they mentioned Kurt Schilling. I believe Kurt Schilling has a podcast on Breitbart.
Yes, yes, and also Kurt Schilling is clearly the kind of athlete that is not, the enemy. He's the kind of athlete it's okay for him to discuss politics and even flirt with conspiracies about Q, so that's okay.
Uh-huh.
Just when the black guys do it, it's not okay.
And it is interesting how much of the first of all, we'll get into it after we finish the clips, but the sort of the smacking and the sort of holier than thou and the sort of liberal supremacism that oozes out through this is pretty disgusting. But in the midst of that, the sort of the amount of Breitbart centered focus around the Q, the Q phenomena, including Q, as I've said before, talking about this article from Breitbart talking about Huber, the prosecutor in Utah, being key to this entire thing, and read that many, many times, and then more and more of some of the Q analysts, shall we call them, the Q tubers, pointing to Breitbart articles is very, very telling.
Yeah, indeed. And what you mentioned, that kind of the oozing of like this supremacy, like liberal supremacist mindset coming from this interview. And those are the kind of things it's important to point out. Psychological perspectives do continue to drive people to Q, because when they see these people just mocking this very real problems in our world, it does make people kind of, it draws you to that side. So it's important to point out too.
Okay, a little bit more of this clip here.
Bite of someone at the rally sort of explaining it, because I think it shows the crazy sort of mystical cult quality of the following of this. Take a listen.
It's Q Anon, the storm, the Great Awakening. This all started back when the president was meeting with military leaders back in October last year. He said, "This is the calm before the storm." That launched us into what the Q team, military intelligence, most likely has been talking to all of us, letting us know what's going on behind the scenes, letting us know the covert battles that are waging between the deep state and President Trump and his military alliance.
So what do you do with that information?
Spread it. Combat the mainstream media. I mean, we're fighting a battle on all fronts here.
What do we, I don't want to get into the details of this because it really is this sort of bizarre Gnostic nonsense, but why is this thing taken hold?
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and then I'll go to the end for another clip. But Greg.
Yeah, I hear you, and that seems to be a pretty fair assessment of what a lot of the biggest Q proponents believe. So in that clip, so I don't think that was too wildly misquoted or anything like that. So
no, it was actually, what's interesting about this is there's a certain amount of actual, although it's all laden with the oozing of the holier than thou, and these people are obviously the dregs of the earth that's coming from the MSNBCs and the CNNs and all of that. In the midst of that, there's a little bit of a fair hearing in terms of what the core facts or beliefs of the QAnon movement phenomenon really is. So that's pretty interesting in the midst of this.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so now I'm going to fast forward to the end of this clip because it'll sort of point out some things I think that I might be able to clarify about how some resonance with the early years of the Obama administration, and also how these kind of operations get run through the mainstream media, and also some of the potential dangers in all of this. Because I believe in part of this clip that we skipped over here, they do reference that this is related to there's a potential for violence here, is the way that they try to frame it, and they talk about it as Pizzagate, and the young guy who went into the pizza restaurant with the gun, and then they refer to the QAnon supporter who showed up at the Hoover Dam and demanded the full release of the IG report, I believe. And so there's, in the midst of all of this, there's a weaponization, there's a setting up of a narrative of the people who support QAnon and are looking into QAnon as potentially violent extremists of some sort that need to be watched very, very carefully.
Yeah. Situation which the platforms once again are aiding this. Here's when users search for Tom Hanks on YouTube, The top 5 videos all accused Hanks of being a pedophile, Sam. Like, this stuff, it starts at the margins, but if you're some person who just searches for Tom Hanks on YouTube, the next thing you know, you're watching one of these videos.
Yeah, I mean, look, you
Sam
hit
Cedar.
the nail on the head in terms of the right-wing echo chamber, and it goes a lot of strange places. Like I said, Alex Jones was promoting this for a long time with Jerome Corsi, who has been well known in terms of swift boating, John Kerry, and then at one point when they realized they were losing the control of the narrative, they started saying that QAnon had actually been overtaken by, I guess, internal spies who were starting to spread disinformation. I mean, it's all part of a narrative, and there's a lot of money to be made with this stuff.
That's the other thing.
Alex Jones is making hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars a year, off of his various different platforms, and that's pretty compelling.
I mean, it's interesting that he brings up Jerome Corsi and then also makes almost the counterpoint that Jerome Corsi made in the midst of the Q phenomena after Corsi became a main spokesperson for it, when he was then denounced, Corsi said that he was being denounced for his involvement in the Q movement because people were Marxists, anti-capitalists, and they hated anybody who tries to make profits. And so there you have Sam Cedar sort of making the facile point of that Alex Jones is monetizing to the tune of hundreds of thousands. I think he underestimates how much Alex Jones actually makes, but that making a sort of a purely economic talking point out of this is the perfectly controlled counterpoint to Jerome Corsi. So here is your anti-capitalist, basically.
I agree, and it's funny to actually hear somebody bring up the Corsi's direct role in Bush's 2004 re-election, since Corsi's pals at InfoWars won't do it, and they hate the Bushes so much. But I digress.
Yes, good point. And of course, we've discussed that many times before, and then also one Roger Stone's background in that also, and then also how those guys are clearly tied into the Israeli intelligence networks. So that is interesting. So at least Sam Cedar brought out this blatant fact that Alex Jones has not told his audience probably ever, potentially, or has justified it, has apologized for it. But then one other last point before I finish this clip is that there is, this of course is all taking place also in the context of the deplatforming of Alex Jones, the civil suits against Alex Jones. A lot of that seems highly weaponized and maybe contrived. Definitely there's some aspect of the civil suits that are seem to be used to control the narrative of things.
We need your help, Jeremy.
Yeah. And so then also this is another case, I believe, of this idea of the potential controversialization also in terms of the way that the QAnon phenomena is being used in a similar way that the Pizzagate phenomena was used, in a very targeted way against very specific political parties. And at the same time, what it does is it controversializes and maybe bad jackets a very important investigation that should be a deeply legal investigation in terms of the abuse of children and sexual trafficking and the deep apparent involvement of some of the highest levels of our societies and governments, which is blatant in terms of the whole BBC, and the British have really had a full mainstream coming out in terms of how much this phenomena was going on in terms of the Jimmy Savile, but also multitudes and multitudes of other involved individuals at high levels of media and government in England were involved.
He was even a prime minister of UK, Edward Heath, back in the 70s. It's been brought out that he was most likely involved in those activities as well. So it goes even beyond just BBC into the government itself. So.
Yes, and so you could see that this might be used to, at the same time, I believe that there is a normalization thing where this can be talked about, and I do think that the aspects of the the QAnon movement, who believe that there's an attempt to normalize potential things like pedophilia. That is a valid point, but at the same time, I believe it's going to be used, this whole situation is going to be used to bad jacket and weaponize the investigation into things like the trafficking of children and sexual predation, and also the nature of how that all works in terms of the blackmail operations that are the basis for our so-called governments.
Indeed, yeah, I agree.
So now we'll just finish off this clip because Chris Hayes makes a reference to Obama and 9/11 Truth that is very, very interesting, and then we'll use that as a touch point to put on some things on the record from 2009. So here we go.
Consciousness, I've sort of seeing that at the rally last night was like kind of a shocking and arresting moment. I really have to say, like, there's the president, and like it would be like if Barack Obama were up there with like a bunch of people being like, Google 9/11 Truth, like, and in like that would be pretty shocking. And that's sort of what we got last night. Sam Cedar, Will Summer, thanks for joining me. Hey there.
So there you go. And very interesting reference to Obama and 9/11 Truth. And that's what the mainstream liberal media usually likes to do in relationship to these kinds of stories, is basically prop the Democrats up by pointing out that the Republican politicians like to dabble or, dip their toe in the water with some of what they define as these right-wing conspiracy theories, whereas you don't have any Democratic politicians ever endorsing 9/11 Truth or something like that, which is a way that they've also used to reinforce the idea that things like 9/11 Truth are some type of left-wing phenomena. And 9/11 Truth is very interesting because it's been very difficult to try to put into a box because of how it defies both the research and the activism around 9/11 Truth completely defies the left-right spectrum divide and conquer analysis. Plus, in addition, you have tons of credible people from not only in this country but around the world who have spoken on that matter, including like the former head of the Italian Supreme Court and people like that. So,
yeah, I agree.
So I wanted to put on sort of on our table something that I believe was maybe not exactly similar to what's going on right now, but there are certain resonances with it, and I think there's certain things that we could learn and watch out for in relationship to what's being set up in the media and what's being pre-scripted, it seems like to me, in terms of potential domestic operations and false flags possibly. But at the same time, I also just want to put some of this and my analysis of it on the record, but also as a way of encouraging people that it's not absurd that grassroots movements, grassroots investigators are going to be heard by the highest levels of power and are going to represent some type of potential threat to the highest levels of power, despite us being psychologically manipulated to think that we are just we have no power in our hands, we're just the fringe, we're just blowing in the wind and no one is hearing us. I believe that there's a lot of indicators that this kind of grassroots analysis and activism that was typified in some ways by aspects of the 9/11 Truth movement is a very potentially powerful political phenomenon that's paid attention to very much by, let's not call it the deep state. The deep state is a whole nother conceptual phenomenon that we've talked about before, which actually goes back to Peter Dale Scott and describes very specifically the intersection of the national security apparatus and the criminal mobbed up global underworld and the relationship of those two. And back last year in one of our shows, I basically put forth the possibility that the Trump administration and its massive mob connections underlying all of it actually represents a moment in in U.S. history where the deep state is sort of flipped, and that the mob underworld that was always being sort of managed and used by the high-level national security types and the intelligence agencies has basically taken the executive branch in some way. But of course, there's also ways in which you could see that it's the national security apparatus of foreign countries maybe, but primarily probably Netanyahu's government in Israel could be seen as having taken the commands of the executive branch in a way that's sort of unique in terms of its severity, potentially. But so I just wanted to bring that up as an idea that the so-called deep state. So we'll put that term aside, but let's talk about the shadow government, the secret shadow government that has its blatant, overt puppet politicians that tell us what we're supposed to know. But this idea of a continuity of government as an ongoing phenomena exemplified by a shadow government, I think is maybe the way to talk about it, does take information activism very, very seriously. So back in 2009 in the spring, a paper was put out by a group of 9 scientists. It had to do with what's been known as nanothermite. It was the title of it started with active thermitic material found in the dust from the World Trade Center catastrophe, maybe it was called. And I don't. Looking back at it, I'm not sure that it is I definitely don't think it's the full story, at the very least, in terms of what happened in Lower Manhattan on 9/11. But it was a critical piece, and I think it may have something to describe about what happened. And it was a critical piece in the development of the 9/11 truth movement in terms of a peer-reviewed scientific study being put into an open science journal for the world to see. And so at that point, I decided that we should start putting this paper sort of out in front of politicians and have them respond to it. So in May, I believe May 15th of 2009, we went to a fellow We Are Change LA member, and I went to an event in Los Angeles where then Vice President Biden was, and I put this paper into his hand. And I think I'll maybe just play a few clips from that in terms of what was actually going down there. And so I put the paper out in front of him, and then this happened.
Story right now. So my question to you is, when are you and President Obama going to ask the Department of Justice to start a criminal investigation in terms of who produced this advanced nanothermite and who put it in the World Trade Center? And if you all are not going to, check it out.
See the report.
And if you all are not going to do that, is it possible for we, the American people, to trust you with our economy if we can't trust you with restoring the rule of law?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
What do you mean, yes?
You can trust them.
Are you gonna do an investigation?
Everybody.
Are you?
So at that point, they shut down the entire event, and the Secret Service pulled a security line. And I believe, looking back, that I made a mistake in following up my original question about when they were going to start an investigation by saying, "Well, what should we, the American people, do if you don't?" And I let him escape with that. So those are the type of things that when you do that kind of information activism and citizens hard-nosed press functions, it's important to look at it afterwards and see where you might have made a failing or you could do better in the future. But this was a very interesting situation. We even got a thumbs up and a congratulations after the fact from a Secret Service member. And it was a very interesting situation. And so that was May 15th of 2009. And I just want to go through a sort of a series of events that happened. And then so about 3 days later, May 18th, I called into the Randy Rhodes show on Air America and told her about this confrontation or this encounter with Biden. She accused me of sandbagging the vice president, but I put forth that this had happened and that this evidence was out there, and that was pretty interesting. So I put that forth onto the record, also onto the internet, that this call had happened. And then later that night, there was an event at the Rand Corporation where lots of us members of We Are Change LA were going to an event with Richard Haass, the then head of the CFR, I believe, the president of the CFR. And I was ultimately turned away from that event. I had RSVP'd, and when I got there, they said that I was not going to be allowed in. I was the only person turned away from that event. Other people from We Are Change LA got in and asked Haass about 9/11, asked him about this continuity of agenda. I believe that's what my friend Stuart Howe asked him about. And then also about his book, which was about war of choice, war of necessity, that became some of the talking points for Obama, actually. So that was happening. And then just a couple of days later, General Richard Myers, the acting head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on September 11th, was at the Richard Nixon Library, and we confronted him there about his changing stories about where he was on September 11th. And then finally, Leslie Gelb, who was the former head of the CFR, I'd talked to him at a Los Angeles Public Library event a little bit earlier, maybe in April. But then on June 1st, video was put up on the record of me having a confrontation with Leslie Gelb about 9/11 and Israeli false flag terrorism and these types of things. And then a few days later came June 4th, 2009, when Obama makes his famous "A New Beginning" speech in Cairo. And so I'm going to play a few clips from that. And as we've talked about before, Greg, Jerome Corsi admitted that he was in Israel at the very same time that Obama was in Cairo making this speech. And will you just flesh out a little bit of the context of what was said about that speech by Obama?
You mean as far as like what people like Jerome Corsi have said about it?
Yes.
Yeah, like you'll hear Jerome Corsi, and I think this was a talking point throughout like a lot of the right-wing kind of right-wing networks, was that this was a speech, Obama's apologizing for America, he's kowtowing to Islam, he's basically this was part of his apology tour where he basically apologized for America and for American strength, and there's, of course, allusions to him just giving in to Islam and all this. I think Corsi uses this as an example of how Obama says that he's studied Islam and all this. And I think as you're about to play, that's a very extremely deceptive way to, obviously, as some of the clips you're going to play from his speech here, actual important overtones from this speech where Obama's basically, he's basically saying that he's going into this part of the world where this action, the actual event of September 11th was done to justify all of this bloodshed and basically is railing against the prevalence of these theories. So, it's basically the opposite of what these operatives on the right want to make out what Obama was doing in this part of the world.
Yes,
this stage of his presidency.
Exactly. So this was a very important moment, and they called it his apology tour and all that. But here he is in Cairo at the University of Cairo, trying to do a reset in a certain way with the Arab and Muslim world compared to the neoconservatives and the George W. Bush agenda in previous years. And at the same time, what you see is what's being replicated, and just like you described. So here we go.
We will, however, relentlessly confront.
He just said something about how that we will never be at war with Islam, is I think what they were clapping about. Okay.
Violent extremists who pose a grave threat to our security. Because we reject the same thing that people of all faiths reject. the killing of innocent men, women, and children. And it is my first duty as president to protect the American people. The situation in Afghanistan demonstrates America's goals and our need to work together. Over 7 years ago, the United States pursued al-Qaeda and the Taliban with broad international support. We did not go by choice. We went because of necessity. I'm aware that there's still some who would question or even justify the offense of 9/11. But let us be clear. Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people on that day. The victims were innocent men, women, and children from America and many other nations who had done nothing to harm anybody. And yet Al-Qaeda chose to ruthlessly murder these people, claimed credit for the attack, and even now states their determination to kill on a massive scale. They have affiliates in many countries and are trying to expand their reach. These are not opinions to be debated. These are facts to be dealt with.
There you go. And so there is Obama reinstantiating the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, let's call it.
Yeah,
September
amazing
11th.
how that turns into how somehow he's actually conspiring with the radical Muslim perpetrators of September 11th when he's actually, and how the whole kind of the InfoWars type narrative goes. It's just ridiculous how they take that and turn it into that rather than he's actually upholding the myths and fantasies which make all of this continue going on behalf of the U.S. government. So.
Yes, exactly. And the amazing hypocrisy of him saying we're against the killing of innocent men, women, and children. And then he, in another piece of it that we won't play, he talks about how he's going to end torture, he's going to shut down Guantanamo. And in a certain way, maybe he did deinstitutionalize torture, but in its place, he escalated the murder and drone strikes as a way of legally solving the problem of indefinite detention is really what he did. And he killed thousands of innocent people, as we know.
Yeah, and then joked about it at campaign rallies by telling a group of singers that he would predator drones if they ever talked to his daughters.
Oh, right. It was a joke. You're right. He made a joke of it in the press. So, and I also would say that this shows also the core importance of something like narratives and truth. In that, in order, even while he was doing a reset with the Arab and Muslim world, and this is also the famous speech where he acknowledged what people have known for decades about that the CIA overthrew the Iranian president or Prime Minister Mossadegh in '53 as a way of basically that's why they said he was apologizing in some way, or that there was going to he was making America seem like apologetic. So that was so he admitted a piece of history while reinstantiating a false narrative that the full force of the government that he represents is behind, apparently. So, and I didn't realize this at the time, but then later on in the speech, he then goes here with it.
The sooner we will all be safer. Now, the second major source of tension that we need to discuss is the situation between Israelis, Palestinians, and the Arab world. America's strong bonds with Israel are well known. This bond is unbreakable.
America's Zionist government is well known.
Cultural and historical ties, and the recognition that the aspiration for a Jewish homeland is rooted in a tragic history that cannot be denied. Around the world, the Jewish people were persecuted for centuries.
It cannot be denied, or else you get put in jail.
Anti-Semitism in Europe culminated in an unprecedented Holocaust. Tomorrow I will visit Buchenwald, which was part of a network of camps where Jews were enslaved, tortured, shot, and gassed to death by the Third Reich. 6 million Jews were killed.
Not 599
more
million.
than the entire Jewish population of Israel today. Denying that fact is baseless, it is ignorant, and it is hateful. Threatening Israel with destruction or repeating vile stereotypes about Jews is deeply wrong and only serves to evoke in the minds of Israelis this most painful of memories while preventing the peace that the people of this region deserve.
So it's preventing the peace to do historical revisionism, and also the linking together of the 9/11 truth and the Holocaust is very, very, very interesting.
Very carrot and stick too. Carrot, hey, we'll disingenuously offering to better relations, but also the stick of, these things are evil and you're going to be punished if you promote them. So
yes, and so then that evening, Rachel Maddow had Zbigniew Brzezinski on her program to discuss the speech, and so in the midst of that, they started emphasizing these two parallel points. So here's what was said there.
And how America views the world, and how Islam and America should view each other. I think he has laid the basis for a much more constructive, much more effective American foreign policy. So I consider this speech to be a watershed, and a particularly gutsy statement by a president who laid it on the line in a way that it should have been laid on the line, and thereby undoing some of the damage inflicted on America over the last 8 years by an administration that was Manichaean in its attitude, that engaged in Islamophobia, that united Islamic extremists with Islamic moderates to our disadvantage.
When the president took time, and he went into both of these issues in some detail, he took time to debunk both 9/11 conspiracists and deniers of the Holocaust, and then announced pointedly that he was on his way to Buchenwald next. Is there a reason to believe that he thinks that those issues are holding back political progress, that those specific sort of conspiracies and misconceptions about modern political history are part of the problem in terms of moving forward?
There's no doubt that in recent years, both many Americans viewed the world in very, very skewed fashion, and many outside of America had a totally conspiratorial view of America, including even the idea that 9/11 was somehow or other a put-up job, that it really wasn't done by Osama bin Laden and others. So I think President Obama is breaking through a whole mythology that has paralyzed American dealings with the world. I think this speech could now be the point of departure for a really constructive policy towards Israel and Palestine and towards Iran. And these are two major problems that need to be addressed if there's to be stability in the Middle East, and if we are eventually to extract ourselves from that region in which we risk becoming bogged down militarily.
Yes. And I guess we'll put aside for now the question of the authenticity of the desires of the Obama administration around stability and potential peace in the Middle East and a new relationship with Iran, although, of course, there are the indicators that some of that was of good faith. But I do just want to point out that here you go, here's Obama's main foreign policy advisor, Brzezinski, basically saying we cannot be able to pursue this new approach to the Arab world and to the Iranians without putting aside this really dark mythology having to do with September 11th mainly, but then sort of lumping in Holocaust and so-called Holocaust denial on top of that. So I think that's very interesting, and I want to wrap this section up, but I do want to then play what happened, because this is actually the meat of why I'm concerned about this timing in relationship to what's going on now, is that I see this as prescripting in many ways. I see this as being responsive to aspects of the 9/11 truth movement and some of the work that we were doing specifically that was really sort of punching into the mainstream consciousness in certain ways. And definitely the people in the government knew what was going on. Secret Service, allowed us to go into the event with Biden. One member even congratulated us after the fact. So people knew what the heck was going on. But then the scripting and the conjoinment of these two issues too by Obama, and then re-emphasized by Rhodes Scholar Rachel Maddow, and then the sort of the dean of foreign policy, Brzezinski, I think is very, very telling, especially since then less than a week later, James von Braun went and was said to have shot up the Holocaust Museum in D.C. And then immediately after, there was a lot of work by such people as Glenn Beck, which I'll play that clip next, of trying to tie von Braun to the 9/11 truth movement. And I just also want to point out that on this exact same morning, June 10th of 2009, I called into the Michael Medved show as he was interviewing the Obama biographer Richard Wolff, and I called out Obama on his hypocrisy around his claims that we respect innocent life, and that he was killing men, women, and children, including probably children his own daughter's age. And then I also pointed out the problem with whether this is actually going to reach the Arab Muslim world in terms of 9/11 truth, and whether he's even then denying the rights of the 9/11 victims' family members who are still pursuing their unanswered questions. And so at the almost at the exact same time, James von Braun, who's then tied to the 9/11 truth movement, is apparently setting off in his car to go shoot up the Holocaust Museum in D.C. And so then you have Mr. Glenn Beck, which we don't hear that much about these days, talking in this way.
Well, hello, America. Everybody today and tonight is going to tell you about the shooting at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where apparently an old, angry white man came in and opened fire with a rifle, critically wounding security guard before two officers shot back. Security guard Stephen Tyrone Johnson has reportedly died. The suspect, James von Braun, is in the hospital now. More details are coming in. We'll talk about those in just a second. But first, here's the one thing. The one thing that they're missing is the pot in America is boiling. And this is just yet another warning to all Americans of things to come. This guy is a lone gunman nut job. He wrote an article titled "Hitler's Worst Mistake, He Didn't Gas the Jews." You're going to see a lot of nut jobs coming out of the woodwork now. There are two very important things that are happening here. First one, it's what I talked about 2 years ago when I talked about the perfect storm. I said that there is a storm formulated.
The storm.
And it's the economy, it is political correctness, it's corruption in Washington, it's militant Islam, it's all of these things. I said, when it comes on shore, there's going to be a go, go, go mentality. And that's what this is. There is a mentality in our enemies. Our country is now vulnerable. Those people who would like to destroy us are enemies like Al-Qaeda. They'd like to destroy us, and they will work with anyone. There are also people like white supremacists or 9/11 truthers that would also like to destroy the country. They'll work with anybody they can. Coming through our southern border, Al-Qaeda is trying to prepare people. I showed you this video last week. Watch this.
4 pounds of anthrax in a suitcase this big, carried by a fighter through tunnels from Mexico into the U.S., are guaranteed to kill 330,000 Americans within a single hour.
That's a very Masonic number. That was weird.
Properly spread in population centers there. What a horrifying idea. 9/11 will be small change in comparison.
Okay, that's enough with that. And so I thought that was very, very telling of Glenn Beck as a clear, some type of, shadow government operative, especially of some of the more right wing elements.
I think that you did, Jeremy. I think you did a good job there of laying out kind of the history of what you might describe as just almost like, in a way, like kind of predictive programming, kind of psychological operation in terms of these high ranking people coming out and in both media and government coming out and labeling the enemy as far as the threat, that being of the September 9/11 truth and of kind of more or less kind of right wing oriented conspiracy theories in general, and then the shooter, and then of course Glenn Beck comes out, and not only this, but I think you could also tie other events into this that happened during the Obama administration. What was it? The guy in Arizona, Loeffner, who shot the Gabby Giffords, and the reason, some of the stated reasons behind that, it's that there was this, you had the environment set up, and that was largely the Tea Party and their quote-unquote anti-government conspiracies that were tied to that. And so now you're seeing this effort where you mentioned the Comet Ping Pong event where the shooter, Pizzagate shooter, and because he was convinced that there was literal child sacrificing going on at this pizza parlor, and then the Hoover Dam incident with the Q supporter. And now you are, and I think this is really the gist of where we're getting at with with our discussing Q in the first place, is now the stage is being set to where you can have it set up in the minds of enough people that these people are ultimately a violent threat, and that can be used to, number one, foment violence in their name, and also, number two, to completely try and discredit any type of legitimate type of any inquiry into this very real problem of sexual trafficking, particularly done against minors, and the political compromise that comes along with it. Very ironically, the Q people don't discuss that this is something a lot of people around Donald Trump have masterminded, the art of political compromise in the name of sex operations. But I digress. Yeah. And then, how this is, go ahead.
Just one last piece, a very short clip that I wanted to play that sort of points out just one other aspect of the threat here, is that the day that We Are Change LA, we went to D.C. just less than 2 weeks later, and we went to be part of an anti-torture rally. But at the same time, we saw that there was a very important opportunity to begin putting these packets of information around 9/11 treason directly into the hands of the Congress people, both House and Senate. And we went the day that we arrived, June 22nd in 2009. A train crash happened, and this is one of the people that was killed. And then we'll be done with this and can move on, Greg.
Okay.
We're learning new details also this morning about the 9 victims of the collision. They came from all walks of life, ranging from a retired general to a struggling mother of 6. It was the height of the afternoon rush and a typical commute for so many on the train. A young mother of 2 on her way to work, a military officer, a 59-year-old woman making plans for a trip of a lifetime, Major General David F. Worley Jr. and his wife Ann, both 62. A career military man, General Worley recently retired as head of the D.C. National Guard. He gave the order to scramble jets over Washington on September 11th.
So that was, I'm not saying I know that all of this is, connected or they're necessarily related, but I thought it was pretty, there was a serious implication, I felt, especially since we ended up talking to a lot of different people, including one Norman Mineta, who was a key witness to aspects of September 11th. And he clearly supported us. He smiled at us and was very friendly with us. I even then also attempted to talk to Eric Holder, and one of his lead security straight-armed me. And I said, I'm just an American citizen attempting to make contact with the Attorney General about a treasonous matter that I've become aware of, and I have information for him. And his main security guard says, I know who you are, and looks straight at me with very sociopathic eyes. And so we talked to a lot of people, including Harry Reid and people on intelligence and judiciary. And so I just bring that up as these are the sort of the context of when you begin to see these ramp ups of these psychologically manipulative statements in the press, where you begin to then see these sort of unfolding events after the fact, is what it looks like to me.
Yeah, no doubt. And so this is something to certainly watch here in the future because, like, you can, like, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be a predictor of the future or anything, but at this point, it seems very likely that, there will be at least isolated, if not major events, that will be blamed on these conspiracy theorists who are obsessed with the government being in society being full of these pedophiles and all this. So I mean, I can see it happening, and that would just be a way to just further fan the flames of divide in our society. So all of this is important for, I think, to keep an eye out on. It's amazing the kind of work you described is not going on anymore ever since now that we've been overtaken with this pro-Trump, just trying to put people in the box and put them in the pro-Republican side. Now that we have to save Trump, you're not seeing the kind of work that your group was doing back in 2009 anymore, which I think is still needed. And unfortunately, we're not getting a lot of that anymore.
No, but the things that that's also part of the reason why I bring this up too is let's remember what our capacity is as activists, and also in the wake of you doing your phone calls to Alex Jones and the Washington Journal. I just want to say let's get back in the game and not sort of be operating out of these contrived boxes of trust the plan or ban the scam or whatever, sort of whatever reactionary thing that's mainly sort of just getting you to sort of hang out in your online YouTube ghettos or make fun of other people. No, let's get back into the truth activism, proactive way.
Yeah, for sure. And we've got about 6 minutes left. I know we had some things we wanted to discuss. What would you like to take the course of the conversation last few minutes?
Yeah, let's just introduce this, and I apologize for eating up so much of the time here, but let's just introduce what we were going to get into a little bit. Would you just introduce it a little bit?
Yeah, we were going to, I think, work to bring out some information that has been put together and corroborated by other sources about perhaps another one of the key players into this quote-unquote Russiagate narrative. I think maybe we've mentioned his name once or twice on our program before, but we've never really gone in depth about him, and that is a now deceased GOP operative by the name of Arthur Finkelstein, and how Arthur Finkelstein ties to so many of the players in this whole narrative, everyone from Netanyahu to people close to Donald Trump, such as Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, and also even to the government of Viktor Orban in Hungary, which, of course, I believe we have identified as being very close to both Putin and to the Netanyahu government in Israel. And just another, I think, perhaps, I don't want to say it's the major connection at this point, but I think it is one of the main connections that's really tying all of these players together.
Yes, and because I've eaten up most of our time here and we won't have that much time to get deep into it, if people are interested in just understanding the entirety, basically, of these networks that we are looking at, they can go take a look at an information graphic by John Swin that's about Lauder Finkelstein network, and it basically lays this entire scenario out. So that singular graphic can be a shorthand to understanding this whole situation and the importance of the Finkelstein-Lauder connection to Hungary and Orban, but then also how that's a key focal point, nodal point to both to Putin's FSB, but then also to the Netanyahu network. And there's an interesting article that's written from a more maybe liberal academic perspective, but it brings in a lot of the key pieces it's in the Hungarian free press called The Budapest Bridge, Hungary's Role in the Collusion Between the Trump Campaign and the Russian Secret Service. And some of the people that are involved in this are becoming more blatantly talked about, including one Paul Manafort, who's in the midst of his trial, but then also Roger Stone, who's apparently potentially under threat of being potentially indicted, but then also Butina, the Russian spy, has connections to some of these key people. But then in this article by Andras Goldner, down in there, he basically he says this, okay. What has not been known up to now is that the unacknowledged architect of this grand strategy was the notoriously secretive Arthur J. Finkelstein, a longtime New York associate of Donald Trump going back to the Roy Cohn days. Finkelstein is perhaps the most bitter opponent of Hillary Clinton amongst a small circle of pro-Republican campaign gurus and a frequent flyer to many of the capitals where Putin is seen as a hero. Finkelstein introduced Paul Manafort years ago to Putin's pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarchs who used their corporate hats to advance Putin's fortunes abroad. Finkelstein also had a big hand in Manafort's addition to the Trump team. Finkelstein has also served as chief political strategist for the past 10 years to Putin's most loyal followers in the Western Alliance, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Finky, as Orban is fond to call him, also works for some of the most notorious autocrats of the former Soviet republics, and always indirectly, so his paymasters can't be easily identified, a skill that he passed on to Trump's ex-campaign chairman Manafort. And then it goes into things about Bannon. But see, Finkelstein's the key figure here, I believe, to sort of paint the picture of exactly what this is because of Finkelstein's deep connection to Netanyahu. And Finkelstein ran Netanyahu's campaign right in '96. And what that you found about the scripting of the language, that you can also see that they call him basically the merchant of venom, with close connections to Roger Stone and Roger Ailes, and you found this in the Israeli press. They typify Finkelstein and talk about his background in terms of scripting the phrases that were used to attack Netanyahu's opponent.
Yeah, Peres, referring to Shimon Peres, will divide Jerusalem. And so I think in a larger scale, and I'll maybe close out by mentioning this, and Finkelstein plays a key role in this, and also other people we've talked about in the past. And I think there's a very good chance we'll be revisiting this topic and hopefully going more in depth about Arthur Finkelstein in the near future. But when you consider his role in playing a main role for Netanyahu, and also the role of people like Richard Perle in writing the clean break document for Netanyahu, I would look at 1996 as being a very important year in shaping the narrative of what we know as the War on Terror and its sister, I guess, the even bigger picture, the clash of civilizations. So.
Yes, and in a future antidote, we will bring in some of the information in the final chapters of Red Mafia by Robert Friedman, where he brings in the Simeon Moglievich and the entirety of the Russian, primarily Jewish mob that's so tied into Israel, and that has potential connections to this key moments and these key moments around the 1996 and the assassination of Rabin. And of course, I'd just like to point out too, and we'll link to all these articles, including the article that we mentioned last week by Jay McKenzie that really goes through a lot of this information. But remember who was the key architect of the clean break paper brought in when Netanyahu came in was one identified now as a head of a Soviet-Israeli cell, one Richard Perle. So I think that's it sort of lays it out a little bit in terms of what we're actually dealing with here. And so I guess until next week, keep digging, and thank you very much for listening. Antidote, we out.
All right, later.